Hey everybody, Heather here. Today we're going to work on our watercoloring card kit of the month for June, and this month I've chosen Party Lucy by CC Designs. She has a cling mount stamp. You do have to cut her out when you get her in your kit, and then you're ready to stamp her. I've already stamped mine on Canson 140 pound watercolor paper. I've also got my medium and my small detail water brush by Zig, and I've got my ink palette by Tim, and then I've got my one I made so that I can mix some colors and wipe it off later. So let's get started. Alright, so I'm going to start with her face, and I'm going to start with the small detail brush, and I've already tested it. I usually try it on the back of my hand to see how wet it is, and I don't want it to leave any water on my skin, but I want it to feel damp when I run it along my finger or the back of my hand. I also have a little paper towel here, and I'll sometimes take it and I'll just put my brush down on it and see how much water soaks into the paper towel to see how wet it is. I don't want it to leave a huge puddle, but I want it to make an indentation when I push down on it. So I'm going to start by coloring her face, and I'm going to start with Tattered Rose for my first layer. So I'm just going to grab a little bit of that on my brush, and I'm just going to actually start down here in her hand first. And I always put my brush down where I want it to be darkest first. So in that case, I want it to be the darkest next to her dress. Same for this side. It looks like I wiped most of the side off, so it puts a little bit more on there. And then I'm going to let that dry, and I'm going to come back and I'll add a little bit more. And then I'm going to go up here to her face, and for her face I want it to be darkest underneath of her hair. So I'm going to start right here underneath of her hair and lay down a little bit of my color, and then I'm going to take that color and I'm just going to wipe it down the rest of her face and smooth it out. Okay, and it's pretty light down here at the bottom, but that's okay because we're going to add some more layers on there. But let's add a little bit to her neck. And again, put it down where you want it to be darkest. So I want it to be darkest underneath of her chin. And then she's got a couple of little ears here too, so let's go ahead and wipe those. Okay, and then again I let that dry, and I'm going to go down here and add a little bit more to her little hands. Okay, so now her face is dry, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a little bit more color onto her face. So grab me a little bit more of my Tattered Rose, and I again start where I want it to be the darkest, so I lay down my color underneath of her hair. And then if I have quite a bit on my brush, I wipe it off and come back just with water on my brush and spread my ink out. Okay, I'm liking the pink tone on that, so I'm going to let that dry for a second, but while that's drying, I'm going to mix a little bit of color for my shadow. So, for my shadow, I'm going to use my little laminated sheet I have here. You could also use an acrylic block, a piece of a CD box, a piece of clear plastic that came with your spellbinder dies, whatever you want to use. So I'm just going to grab a little bit of Tattered Rose, and I'm just going to wipe it down here at the bottom on my sheet, whatever you're using. Just put a little blob on there. And then I'm going to grab a little bitty bit of tea dye. So again, I grab a little bit of that on the end of my brush, and I'm just going to swirl it into this Tattered Rose. Mix it up a little bit. And you don't need very much shadowing color, so I'm only going to use a little bit. So this little bit will be plenty for me to shadow my girl. Okay, so then I'm going to take my mixed color and I'll grab a little bit onto my brush and I'm going to use it to shade where I want to add a little bit darker shadow. So like light here on her hand next to her dress, I would add a little bit. And then underneath of her neck. Up here underneath of her hairline. Maybe a little bit down the side of her face. Okay, and then I wipe my brush off and I just want to soften that line just a little bit and blend it in. So I'm just going to wipe it very gently and just blend it out into the rest of the color. Maybe add a little bit down here on her ear. And maybe on the inside of this ear just a little bit. Okay, and I like how the shadow on that looks. That looks pretty good. And so now, I'm going to let that dry just a second, and I'm going to add some worn lipstick for her cheek color. Okay, so I've got a little bit of worn lipstick on my brush, and I'm just going to dab. Worn lipstick's really dark, so I'm going to dab a little bit on there, and that's a lot, but look how much I still have on my brush. There's quite a bit. So I'm going to wipe all that excess off. I'm going to come back and I'm going to make her cheeks a little bit bigger, but look, I'm still picking up a lot of ink on my brush. So again, I'm going to wipe the excess off. Do the same thing for this cheek. Wipe the excess on my brush off on my paper towel. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to just continue doing that, spreading her little cheeks out and wiping my brush off until I get them as big as I want and blended on the sides. Okay, and then I'm going to let that dry and I'll come back and I'll add some more pink tones to her cheeks after it's dry and I can see maybe if it needs a little bit more. So while that's drying, I'm going to go up here and I'm going to work on her hair. And for her hair this time, I only used Vintage Photo. So I'm going to grab a little bit of, well actually I'm going to switch to my medium brush because her hair's got quite a bit of area there. So I want to cover more area. So I'll get a little bit bigger brush so I can wipe more ink at a time. Okay, so now I've got my medium brush. I'm going to pick up a little bit of my Vintage Photo, and again you want to start where you want your hair to be the darkest. So I want my hair to be darkest right next to this little hair bob and down the back of her ponytail. And then I'm going to wipe my excess ink off and I'm going to use the ink I laid down to spread out onto the rest of her hair. And your brush gets wet as you're using it, so you may want to wipe it off a little bit in between. But just like that. Okay, and we're going to do the same thing for this side. So again, I'm going to put my ink down where I want it to be darkest, which is right next to that little hair tie, and then along the side of her hair. I'll wipe my excess ink off and then just use my brush to spread the ink that I laid down out onto the rest of her little ponytail. Okay, now let's do up here onto her hair. So I want her hair to be darkest up here on the crown of her head. So I'm going to start there by putting down a little bit of my ink right up here where they got these great little lines for me already. And I have quite a bit of ink there, so I'm going to wipe my brush off. Remember, you can always add more later. And then I'm just going to use my brush to spread this down with just water down along her hair. And if your brush gets too dry, make sure to give it a little squeeze, and then I'll refill your water in the tank. Okay, I'm going to let that dry a little bit. I'm going to go down here and I'm going to add a little bit more ink to her cheeks. So I'm going to grab a little bit of my worn lipstick on the end of my brush. I'm just going to add a little bit more color here. Wipe off my excess and then just kind of pat it a little bit along the side. Alright, so let's go up here and I want to add a little bit more color to her hair. So I'm going to grab me a little bit more of my paint, my vintage photo, and darken it up maybe just a little bit right here in the crack of her hair. And it's all up to you how dark you want to make it. So I have a little bit here on her hair bob, so let's get that and wipe that off. So I'm just going to get that wet and then use my paper towel to suck the ink back up. I'm going to let that side dry and I'm going to go over here and I'm going to add a little bit more to this side. Maybe a little bit more to her hair here. I'm kind of liking how it is light down here, but I'm going to add some more dark color up here at the top. Maybe right here along the side, darken it up just a little bit. Okay, and then we'll let that dry, and then you can go back and decide if you want to add a little bit more on top of that later. But for her face, I'm going to go down here, I'm going to add a little bit more of my, I'm going to grab some Tattered Rose, and I'm going to just add a little bit over the top of her cheeks here to blend in the color a little bit better from her cheek color out here into the rest of her face, so it doesn't have a big bubble line there on the side. There, that looks much better. Okay, so let's go down and let's start on her dress. And for her dress and these little hair ties, I've used bundled sage. But because her hair is still wet a little bit up here, I'm going to let that dry and work down here on her dress where I haven't been coloring. So I'm going to grab a little bit of my bundled sage. And again, lay it down where you want it to be darkest. So I want her dress sleeve to be darkest next to her body. And then it's going to be dark up here underneath of her hair, underneath of her face. Same with this sleeve. Right next to her body I'm going to make it darkest. And then I'm just going to use that ink to color the rest of her sleeve. And then I want her dress down here has these cute little pleats. So I want the pleats to have a few, to be a little bit darker. So I'm going to run it right along this bow and then use my excess ink to color the rest. So it's a little bit darker in the crack. Same with this side. Be darkest up here against the bow. And I'll make each one of these pleats, I'll make it darkest right next to the little line on this side. Okay, and then we're going to let that dry. So while that's drying, I'm going to go up here and add some color to her little hair ties. And then her socks I've also made striped. So I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of my color down there. So you can pick whatever stripe you want to start with. I'm going to go ahead and pick this stripe, and I'm going to make it go dark to light from the inside of her leg out. So grab a little bit of ink, put it on the inside. And then just use the excess to spread it over to this side of her leg. And then we're going to do the same thing for this side. So pick you a stripe, lay down some ink in the middle, and then just use the excess to wipe over to the edge. And we're going to go back and we're going to add our second coat now that it's dried. Remember, if you have a lot of ink on your brush still, like mine still has quite a bit on there, I'm going to wipe that excess ink off and then just use my brush to feather out my line that I've laid down. So I'm not pulling quite so much out here to the outside edge. It's staying darker down here towards her ponytail. Okay, and let's go add some down here to her dress. And same thing, remember, if you have too much on your brush, wipe that off, and then just use the water in your brush to soften the edge and pull it out towards the side. Add a little bit more down here to her skirt. And then we let that dry. And let's do her socks. I want to darken those up a little bit. Alright, while her dress is drying, for the next color, I'm going to go down here and add a little bit of color to her shoes. And for her shoes, I'm going to use Walnut Stain. And I want her shoes to be darkest on the inside of her foot. So I'm going to start there by putting my color down on the inside of her shoe. I'm going to come across the bottom. And then I have a lot of ink still on my brush, so I'm going to wipe all that off. And then I'm going to take my brush, and I'm just going to use my brush with the water to wipe this walnut stain across the whole side of her shoe so it comes to the rest on the other side. And then I'm going to let that dry because that's not very much, but that's enough for our first coat, and then we'll come back and add some more. So we're going to do the same thing for the other side of her shoe. I'll grab some more walnut stain. I'll run it down the inside of her shoe and along the bottom, wipe my brush off, and then use the water on my brush to spread the ink over to the other side of her shoe. And then we'll let that dry. Okay, so for her dress up here, it looks like I used a little bit of mixed color to add a little bit of shadows into her dress. So like we did with the face, I'm going to grab just a little bit of my bundled sage on the end of my brush and wipe it on my block or paper or whatever you're using. And then I'm going to grab a little bit of black soot on my brush. And black soot's really dark, so you just need a very little bit. So maybe grab just a little bit of the stray ink that's off to the side and mix it in with your color. So we just want to darken it up just a little bit. And then I'm going to use that to go in here and add some shadows to her dress. So let's say like right along the side of the her bow. Add a little bit more shadow maybe right next to the sleeve where her dress is touching it. Maybe up here next to the top of the bow, up here and around the side. Down each of these little creases. A little bit right here. Darken it up just a little bit. And you could also do the same thing down here on her socks, just on the inside edge of her sock. Get a little bit of your dark color right next to the edge of her leg. And just darkens it up just a little bit. Alright, while that's drying, we're going to go and mix our color for our bow and our alternate stripes on our socks. And for that I used antique linen and scattered straw. So I start with my antique linen, and I grab some of that on the end of my brush. And because it's the first color, I forgot to tell you that already, I usually have more of that than the second color. So I grab a little bit of that, and then scattered straw is my second color. So I go up here and I get a little bit of that on the end of my brush and mix it into my color. And you may want to try your tested colors out on a scrap piece of paper first to see if they're the color you like. I usually just wing it, but you may want to try it first and see if you like the color. But I just mixed a little bit of both of those onto my little sheet here, and then I'm just going to grab a little bit of my paint, and I'm going to go down here and start where you want it to be darkest. So I'm going to do that right next to her body there, and down here next to the bow. And this back bow is going to be a little bit darker, so I'm going to put a little bit more on that one in the back. And then her socks down here have alternate stripes, so let's get those. And again, I lay down my color in the middle of her sock first, next to in the middle of her legs, and then go towards the outside of her legs with my color. And if you're running out of ink like I am for my second coat, I'll let this dry and I'll mix up a little bit more. And if you have to mix up more and you want it to be a little bit darker, go ahead and go in and maybe add just a smidgen more of your second color to this one, and it'll make it just a little tad darker, and then you can go back and it'll add a little bit more shadows the next time you go through. Okay, so once your color's dry, you go back and you add a little bit more for shadows. So I've made me some more color. I'm just going to add a little bit more in here. And some of these areas are pretty small, so don't forget you can wipe the brush off in between.